given the opportunity to create a sustainable food system on the Old Coggins Farm, how would you go about that? And as someone with the ability to think it through in ways that most of us don't have, here, place-specific is a way that you could create a sustainable food system. Dylan Ryals-Hamilton.
So my name is Dylan Ryals-Hamilton. I've been involved in ecological land use and finding out, exploring ways to meet basic human needs using the same principles that have been time tested to design a sustainable human settlement. So that means food, housing, water, and all those things. How do we harmonize all those things? And how do we harmonize all the elements in a farm system, in an urban homestead, even in a city park? How do we harmonize the different elements that exist in that system so that it actually creates a system? It creates a whole that's greater than the sum of its parts. And that's, in a nutshell, what permaculture design is all about. So I'm on the docket as a integrated land use designer, and that sums it up pretty well. So I was really delighted to be invited by Ian to come take a look and do a little play around. You know, what's the big vision? What if I really had my druthers? What would I like to see in a farm like the Coggins place? I wanted to just take a step back and look at our local food system as we've been doing for the past little while with John Swan and with Cameron. Thank you both for, I'm so glad you both came before me so I don't really have to paint this whole picture. But we are in a food insecure situation. There are many people in Western North Carolina who do not have access to good, healthy, nutritious food already. And the people who do have access to it are mostly getting it from very far away. And so if we're really realistically looking at sustainable food systems in this region for the future, we really need to look at production of nutrition. And that means more than just growing lettuce and kale. We're also talking about fats and proteins and things like that. And so how do we source, how do we grow those things regionally? And how do we really feed ourselves into the future? So again, looking at these two different extremes of the way we could approach a new agricultural enterprise. We could move in, bulldoze, hack everything down, plow, bring in big machines, and create a big farm infrastructure that employs a few people, not very many people year-round. Maybe you pull in some unskilled labor seasonally for harvests and things like that, and we all know what that looks like, the big industrial farm model. The other end of the extreme is very little, maybe selective timber harvest, very little logging or selective timber harvest, even just for the use on site. Production implemented in phases, so starting small and working outward from a controlled front, starting small and working outward from a nucleus, right? So eliminating the need to have a huge amount of upfront capital to get something happening on the ground right away, right? This other end of the spectrum would focus on a diversity of crops and a redundancy of income streams. So having more than one place where the money is coming from. I think most folks who have been here for a while will remember when it was an Easter weekend. I think it was around 5 or 6 years ago now. We had a big late freeze that was totally unexpected, totally unanticipated, and it wiped out about 80% of the apple crops in Henderson County. And so that happened as a result of having too specific of an income stream. All those apple orchards had maybe 2 or 3 or 4 varieties of apples they were growing, and all of the ones that were early season apples got nailed. And so that wiped out, and a huge number of those farmers lost their shirt and were unable to continue with their operations. So we're looking for a redundancy of income streams, a diversity of crops, meaning we have money coming from a lot of different places. Now, of course, you have to have the skills and the human power to make that work. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how that could be achieved. But this other end of the spectrum would be supplementing or supporting financially several very skilled workers throughout most of the year, rather than having a whole bunch of folks come in for harvest season or something like that. So those are two ends of the spectrum, and I bet you know which end I tend to lean toward. I bet you can guess. But of course, every farm's going to fall somewhere in the middle there. You know, I'm painting it as a spectrum. It's not one or the other. It's not a dichotomy. You're somewhere in between. And that's going to depend on the size of the farm and the number of people involved and the upfront capital and the values of the farmers and many, many, many other things. Really quickly, I want to explain this concept of ecological succession. Because we live in a forest, and forests tend to really want to be. They want to grow. Life happens, right? And so what nature is always doing is trying to move itself toward an old-growth forest. And so when there's a disturbance in nature, a clear-cut or a natural disturbance such as a fire or a major flood or an avalanche or anything like that, there's a disturbance and you've got very little plant life going on. The first things that move in are things like lichens, and then you get little grasses and a lot of the things that we consider weeds, the really weedy things that thrive in those disturbed soils. And then you have pioneer species, and you have things like the black locust trees and the tulip poplars and things like that. And the forest is constantly, each generation of plants and animals, all the flora and fauna, each generation is preparing the way for the next. And so they create the conditions that ultimately lead to what would have been here several hundred years ago would be a oak, hickory, chestnut forest would be the ultimate succession. So nature is always trying to push from one end, from the disturbed end, all the way to the well-developed old-growth forest. And as long as we are trying to keep things back at the annual agriculture phase or the lawn, we are fighting that natural succession. It takes a lot of energy to push against that. And John was talking earlier about our energy situation and the reality of that, and that is a very real reality. And it takes mowers and tractors and chainsaws and all kinds of things to keep pushing that back. And so since we live here in a forest, why don't we start thinking about what you can actually do in a forest? Well, how does a forest want to be? What wants to grow in a forest? What wants to exist there? What will really work in this region? The alternative is we can cut down as many forests as we need to grow all our own food for this region. That's a little less ideal in my mind. So I'm not saying annual agriculture is bad and we should never do it, but it's all on a scale. And these are just things to take into consideration. And I think many of the folks in this room probably understand, many of the folks in this region understand the importance of local food and supporting local farmers. And so a lot of what I'm going to want to focus on is going to be kind of actually pushing that edge even a little further, getting even a little more radical with talking about what kinds of foods we're actually growing and why. So the Coggins Farm has forested areas. It has areas that would be suitable for pasture. It has a really fantastic bottom land down by the river. You've seen some photographs of it up here. Some nice agriculture, some nice plowed fields, thanks to Ron and many other folks, or at least a few other folks, have done some really great work, really beautiful soil down there. And that would be a great place to grow a lot of the things that we typically buy at the tailgate market. I'm not going to focus really heavily on those kinds of things, but to look at instead how do we use the forested land, how do we use the land that might be suitable for pasture, and that sort of thing to create a sustainable food production system. But first, I have to ask, who's actually going to be farming this land? Who's actually living here? Because that is the most important fundamental question. Before I go in to do any kind of design, I get goal statements and really try to learn a lot about the client, the person who's actually going to be inhabiting the space. What are their wants and needs? And so that's all highly variable. So there's a lot of different things to consider. In particular, how many people are going to be there and how much time are they willing and able to spend doing it? How old are they? How physically able are they? Are we talking about multiple families? This is a pretty large tract of land. So are we talking about multiple families farming this land, or multiple individual farmers with their own enterprises working together? Who are the farmers? So that's the first question we have to ask. There are business models out there for creating something like a land trust or a partnership, an actual partnership or a corporation that owns the land, a small corporation. I know that's sometimes a dirty word in some people's mind, but you can have small corporations too. But an entity, a legal entity that owns the land, that then leases parts of the land out to individual farmers for them to do their individual farm enterprise. And they can do that and work synergistically together to get a great diversity of crops for a redundancy of income streams, as well as integrating those different crops for maximum production so that each one actually benefits the other. What do I mean by that? Kind of creating this business ecosystem. Well, first let's talk about what we could possibly grow here in Western North Carolina mountain farmland, and what specifically could we grow on the Coggins Farm. The typical annual vegetables that we're all familiar with, most of which came from Europe: nuts, berries, orchard fruits, more specific specialty vegetables that you don't see at Ingles or at Aldi, that sort of thing. Cut flowers, sustainable cut flowers is an industry whose time has come for this region. People are willing to pay more for flowers than they are for food, as silly as that might sound. And it's really, but the floral industry is a very, very toxic business with a lot of downsides. And so we need to detoxify that industry and bring it back here. And there are some folks that are producing cut flowers locally. But that's a potential cash crop that I think is not being really, people aren't digging into that as much as they could be yet. Also animals, chickens, cows, pigs, turkeys, things like that could potentially be integrated into a large-scale farm system like this. And woodland medicinals. Somebody mentioned black cohosh earlier, ginseng. There are so many different amazing botanical plants, woodland botanicals, that we can grow in this region that have powerful medicinal properties and are high value and are currently often being wild harvested unsustainably. So that's another potential market item. And then you may have seen the pictures of the greenhouse. There's a greenhouse on site, and a good solid greenhouse with a good system for heating and keeping it warm overnight and things like that, perhaps by integrating it with keeping chickens in there. Folks do that to keep it warmer at night. A good greenhouse could potentially produce food that we otherwise can't be growing here in winter, which has its own special niche market as well. So folks who are growing greens and things like that throughout the entire season, that's a market that could be getting filled. And then, of course, the site also has great water. There's streams on both sides. It has a lot of potential to catch water on the landscape and divert it and funnel it and create several catchment ponds. You could potentially do some aquaculture systems with something like that as well. So there's just some of the ideas of some of the actual crops that we could be producing there on site. And all of these things that I just mentioned could be integrated into this farm system with a minimal disturbance of what's already there. Building some fencing is about the biggest disruption that I could imagine that you'd have to do to get some of this going. And maybe bringing in earth-moving equipment to build the ponds, so they'd have to be isolated, kept out from mowing the forest down, right? Got to watch those machine operators. So all of these can be integrated with minimal disturbance. So here's a few different strategies that you could potentially use. You could use goats for the early years of this farm enterprise to do some initial clearing of underbrush, some very selective logging for timber that either can be used on site or sold for a profit. But the key is small and slow. So goats allowed to range in a isolated area, one small area where they can't eat everything because otherwise they will. And use those as the clearing strategy, dairy goats or meat goats, what have you. That could be the first few years. We could have mixed orchards here with bees and with all kinds of different perennial and annual cut flowers integrated into that mix. So you could have orchards, so you have fruit crops, honey, and cut flowers, all coming from the same system, all pretty harmoniously integrated. And then you have rotational grazing. Rotational grazing done properly, moving the animals quickly enough from one place to the other. It does require some fencing, once again. But rotational grazing done properly can actually improve the soil fertility of a site rather than degrade it. So there's a lot of arguments about eating meat and how devastating and impactful it is on the landscape, but if it's really done consciously, the great herd animals were the major nutrient providers, and we can just mimic those systems. They move in, they create a disturbance, they leave a lot of manure behind, and when they move on, life comes back and it flourishes. So rotational grazing. There's a concept called silvopasture, and this is just simply the concept of bringing animals in to graze and pasture, but mixing trees in, like orchard, fruit-producing trees, something like that. So we could do silvopasture. We could do alley cropping. This is just the simple concept of having rows of trees or bushes or large shrubs in between rows of annual crop production. And they provide windbreak. You might have some nitrogen-fixing trees in there, like black locust, which you can then coppice down, cut it down to the stump. It fixes nitrogen in the soil, and it happens to be just adjacent to the annual crops. So you've got boom, boom, boom. You're increasing your fertility. You're providing some shade relief, perhaps, from the scorching western sun in the middle of the hot summer when some crops are failing. So alley cropping has a lot of benefits. And then there's the concept of forest gardening, and that's not gardening in a forest, but it's gardening like a forest. And so that's the idea where you plant a whole forest, but you design the forest so that the canopy layer, the upmost canopy of trees, are things like nut trees, really tall, growing, food-producing trees. The subcanopy is maybe fruits, things like pawpaws, persimmons. Now, these are things that could not be distributed to California, but could be distributed potentially locally. They don't ship and store well. They end up pretty mushy by the time they end up on the other side. But locally, that's a potential. It's not only a potential market, but it's also a potential major food source. And those two fruits, by the way, if you've never had a pawpaw or a persimmon, are just two of the most incredible flavors on earth. So I urge you to go out and try some. And then we can integrate all of those strategies that I just mentioned. All of the above can all be put together, pieced together, and work in synergy. So again, you have the silvopasture concept with cows being integrated into the orchards. You have beekeeping, aquaculture, forest gardens, animals. You grow, cows, run the chickens back behind the cows. Creates a synergistic effect, multitude of benefits, but just by rotating the chickens in right behind where the cattle just went. And you get the animals are eating all the rotten and fallen fruit, so you're breaking the pest cycles. You're creating a lot of benefits for both, on both ends. I was just watching a video about a permaculture guy who was being interviewed, and somebody asked him, how do you market your pigs? Because he was doing the same system, pigs with an orchard system. And he said, well, people just hear that I'm the guy that has pigs that are raised on apples and finished on acorns and hazelnuts, and they call me up. So, yeah, sounds like pretty good pork, right? So all of those things can be integrated. The biggest thing that I would be looking at in a situation like this, especially this many acres, is just a diversity of products, creating a redundancy of income streams. That's the big take-home point. And of course, it all comes in a context of the local community and the nutritional needs and the market demands of that local community. And you obviously have to pay attention to that before you engage in any kind of agricultural or any other market enterprise. And of course, it's really important to always leave, in permaculture we call it the zone 5, which is the wilderness land, just some untouched areas, particularly along the creeks and on really steep slopes where it's hard to grow a lot of food or where people shouldn't really be walking around anyway. You make sure that you set some of it aside to invite what I like to call the great mystery, and let nature come in and magic happens in so many different ways. So I will conclude with that, and except just to say that, of course, in order to support a farm model like this, we have to develop a regional cuisine that's bioregionally appropriate, right? So we have to create the demand for all of those things. We have to want fruits and nuts, and if we are going to eat pork, we need to demand that the pork be raised on apples and finished on acorns and hazelnuts. Thanks.